Lena. This is most of the people I work with. They're not speakers. They're entrepreneurs that want to boost business. They're executives that want to get a promotion. They're that necessarily want to be on stages. Your stage is your quickest way to having impact. I mean, and that you talked about it in the introduction. I always tell people there's basically three types of motivation in any audience. There are people, we can generalize here, we'll say, so your 20-year-olds, they're interested in how do I boost my income. Your 40-year-olds, they've already made it, but they're not spending enough time at home, and so they're wondering, how can I boost my freedom? And then your 60-year-olds, they've already made it, and they're thinking about their legacy, and so they're wondering, well, how can I boost my impact? If you can address all of those things in your presentation, you're addressing all the needs of your audience.
Welcome to the Servant Leaders Mindset Podcast, where we are transforming lives through servant leadership. Welcome to the show. Today, I'd like to introduce you to my very special guest, Dr. Danny Brassell. He is a highly sought-after speaker, trainer, and coach. He's also known as Jim Carrey with a PhD. Dr. Brassell has spoken to over 3,000 audiences worldwide and authored 16 books. His latest book is titled Leadership Begins with Motivation. Additionally, Dr. Brassell co-founded one of the world's leading reading engagement programs. Beyond this, he shows business owners, entrepreneurs, and executives how to increase their income, freedom, and impact by creating engaging presentations. Welcome to the show, Dr. Brassell.
Thanks so much, Lena. Thanks for all that you do. You're spreading some joy in the world. I love you. Appreciate you.
Thank you. I appreciate you too. So I'd like to start by talking about your book, Leadership Begins with Motivation. What was the inspiration for the book?
Well, Lena, when I was a middle school teacher, I was the only teacher at the school who had no tardy students. I taught in South Central Los Angeles, and my students always wanted to come to class on time because I always started off class with a Paul Harvey story. I don't know if you remember Paul Harvey. He used to come on the radio every day at 12:15. He'd be like, "I'm Paul Harvey with the rest of the story." And he would tell you his story, and you're trying to guess who's he talking about or what's the company. And my students absolutely loved it. But the problem is a lot of those stories are about like Sears and Roebuck. Well, kids today don't know what Sears and Roebuck is. And so the reason I wrote the Leadership Begins with Motivation book was to have an updated homage to Paul Harvey, but of people, from more current times like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and everything. As a matter of fact, it's kind of interesting. After I wrote the book, I read the book and I thought, this is interesting. Completely unintentionally, so many of my examples in this book are white male Americans. And so the book I'm almost done writing right now, almost all the examples are females, minorities, and international people. And I'm really excited I'm actually more excited about this book than the other one.
Well, leadership has changed over time, so that doesn't surprise me. So what is the most important thing that you think that you want people to, what takeaway, what is the most important takeaway you want people to have after they read your book, this book or the one that's about to come out?
I just want people to be inspired. I think we live in a very negative society. I was watching this horrible show on TV the other day called The News, and it totally depressed me because it was nothing but negativity. I think people need a little bit more hope. It's actually one of the things that distinguishes me when I'm working. I work with individuals, entrepreneurs, and organizations on how to leverage speaking on stages to increase their client leads. And I'm a little bit different than a lot of people because a lot of people teach you how to tell your sad story. And I'm not saying it's not effective. It's actually a very effective technique, but there's three reasons why I prefer not to do that. First of all, the world just survived a global pandemic. Everybody's been through a lot, and I think we need more hopeful stories. Second of all, when I'm working with people, we're creating, you can call it whatever you want. I've heard people call it the signature talk. Politicians will call it your stump speech. Like it's your origin story. You can call it peanut butter and jelly. It doesn't matter. But this is a speech that you deliver again and again to introduce yourself to new audiences. Well, a friend of mine, his daughter was killed in a school shooting, and he's told that story now to over 1,000 audiences. I don't know about you, Lena. You got to be much stronger than me to talk about the worst day of your life over 1,000 times. And then third, and this is where people get angry with me, I have one objective when I'm on stage. I want you to leave feeling better than when you came in. I want you laughing, smiling, happy. I can tell the same joke again and again. I think there's something admirable about trying to get people to feel better about themselves. I believe when you tell that same sad story again and again, by the 20th time you've told it, now those are crocodile tears and you're just being manipulative. And I'm not saying it's not an effective strategy. It's a very effective strategy. But I, for one, don't want to have to take a shower after I speak every single time. I want to be serving my audience, not manipulating my audience.
Hmm. Hmm. A good point. Excellent point. As you were speaking, I was thinking also, though, I told you right before we started the interview that I listened to other motivational speakers, and a lot of them, when they do the coaching, they try to hone in on what makes your brand, or you called it signature speech, or something that really just reveals who you are at your core. How do you tease that out of the person that you're coaching and bring them to that positive speech that
Perfect.
you want people to walk away with, that feeling of feeling better than they did before you started talking?
That's a great question, Lena. So my partner Jimmy Hayes Nelson and I we lead what we call well-crafted story workshops, and so it's an activity. It's a mind activity to get you to think about situations. This is a simple one for your audience. So after the podcast, sit down in a nice, comfortable chair with a pen and paper and a libation of choice, and for an hour, I want you to write down every story that's ever happened in your life. And I don't mean the whole story. I just mean triggers, like the time I locked myself out of the car in front of Costco, the time dad spilt mustard on his tie at that fancy restaurant. You'll find in just an hour, it might not even take that long, you'll come up with 400 or 500 of these stories. So that is the first part of the exercise. The second part of the exercise is then you look at each story and you try and figure out, well, what's this really a story about? Oh, this is a story about loyalty. Oh, this is a story about overcoming adversity. Oh, this is a story about responsibility. And if you were to go onto my computer, I literally have hundreds of files with thousands of these stories. So whenever I'm looking for a story for one of my talks, I'll insert one of those stories. And I mean, we say that you're only a well-crafted story away from seven figures, and we've seen this time and time again. I mean, last year we were working with this guy Gustavo, and Lena, Gustavo should be the president of the United States. He came to America from Ecuador 30 years ago, didn't speak a word of English, did every menial job possible, saved every dime, invested in real estate, and 30 years later, he's worth like 30 or 40 million dollars. And so we were working with Gustavo, and one of the things I always tell people is if you really want to get better at speaking, there's two ways to do that. First of all, you got to watch lots of speakers. I mean, I watch at least 10 speakers a day. I know you do too. I watch motivational speakers. I watch politicians. I watch comedians. I watch televangelists. I watch them in front of big groups, in front of small groups. That's the first thing you have to do. Second of all, one of my mentors was a guy named Jim Rohn, and Jim used to say, you can't pay other people to do your push-ups. Translation, you got to give that speech. You got to go out there and speak to Rotary clubs and elementary schools and chambers of commerce. And so Gustavo, his offer, he has a 4-month real estate program for $40,000. Now, Lena, I craft a lot of offers. That's a very big ask in a speech, but I insisted to Gustavo, I'm like, hey, you got to get out there and give this talk. Let's see how effective it is. And he said, well, I'm going on a podcast later this evening. I'm like, all right, here's my phone number. Gustavo, you got to call me tomorrow. Tell me how you did. And so he calls me the next day, Lena. He's like, Danny, you are a genius. I'm like, did you go on the podcast? He's like, yes, I did. I'm like, did you make the offer? He's like, yes, I did. I'm like, did you sell any? He's like, 23.
Wow.
Reading's my specialty, not math. But if I'm doing my math correctly, that night he made $920,000 on a speech that we had created that afternoon. And since then, he and I are still in contact. He's made 8 figures off of this one single speech. That's the power of the speech. And the reason I love coaching a person like Gustavo is, my grandpa had a saying. He said, there are thems that does and thems that talks. And thems that does gives thems that talks something to talk about. I love Gustavo because he went out and he did the work. Most people never do a dang thing. So I know you have the same thrill. It's what I love about your podcast. It's an action podcast. Like, let's get out there and make the world a better place.
Wow, excellent, excellent. So, why do you think motivational speaking is so important to leadership? And my second question to that would be, how do you know, like when you're talking to a group of people, that they're becoming motivated by what you're saying?
Well,
How do you sense that from the
yeah, those
audience?
are good questions, Lena. Nobody's ever asked me those questions. I mean, so motivation is everything to me. I mean, leadership begins with motivation. Like, you need to get yourself, and even people like you and me, people, but we still need those inspiring stories. You and I were talking about we both love. I love Les Brown. I've met Les. Les is not just one of the best motivational speakers I've ever seen. Better yet, he's also an incredible human being, which a lot of these people are not. He actually walks his talk. All of us need that boost of energy. I mean, even Rocky had Mickey in his corner, giving him a word from every now and then. You can do this. Now, how effective we know we are. This is actually very important with me, Lena. When I'm working with people, I say, everybody gives you a standing ovation, but that's not how I measure success. It's great if people come up to you after your presentation and say, "What an incredible speech." That's not that's not what I look at. The only way I measure your effectiveness is, do people take the next step? So, for example, Gustavo made his offer on his podcast. He had 23 people enroll in his program. Maybe you're not offering a $40,000 coaching program. Maybe you just want people to sign up for your free book. Well, based on your audience, if you have over 50% of your audience signing up for that book, then you're doing a pretty good job. If you get 70%, you're doing a really good job. You get above 70%, you're just stellar. And the more reps you have, the better you're going to do. But that's the only way you can actually measure a talk. The talk's effectiveness is, are people actually going to take action? It's great if people like you, but there's all kinds of research that shows most people forget what you told them within 24 hours. So what we're trying to do is get them. Zig Ziglar used to say this. Zig, he'd been a speaker for 30 years, and uh, late in his career, he actually did a survey of what people found the most motivational about him. And he was blown away. Out of every 100 surveys, only one person said it was from your talk. The other 99 were, oh, it's from your tapes and your books and listening to them again and again. And that is really important to remember. That means you can make a huge difference on the stage, but the way you have an impact, a lasting impact with people, is with that call to action. What's the next step that person's taking? Whether it's all of a sudden in your coaching program, or they're reading your books, listening to your different trainings, whatever it may be. That's how we evaluate if your speech is effective.
Mm, that's interesting. Yeah, very interesting. So if a person if they go and they speak in a public conference and they have their books and stuff and collateral materials, etc., the people pick those up, they get a sense of whether how effective they are.
But the mistake I see most people make is they have multiple offers. And Lee Clow, he did the 1984 ad for Apple. He was good friends with Steve Jobs. This is a very important teaching point for your audience to remember. Is Steve had created a new Mac that had these 5 components he wanted to talk about in the ad. And Lee Clow, the ad executive, he crumbled up a piece of paper and he threw it at Steve Jobs, and Steve Jobs caught it. He said, "That's a good ad." Then he crumpled up 5 pieces of paper and threw them at Steve, and Steve couldn't catch any of them. And he's like, "That's a bad ad." The mistake most people make is they make multiple offers from the stage. Grocery stores understand this more than anybody. You look at a place like Trader Joe's, they sell more because they don't give you choices of mustard. They give you one type of mustard. Uh, so you have to have one call to action. Even when people are saying they want to stay in touch with you, it's ridiculous. I see people, oh, here's my email address, here's my Facebook, here's my Instagram. You're overwhelming people. They can't make the decision. People are simple. Give them one thing to focus on.
Interesting. So, okay, so what if can anybody be a good speaker? What about those who dread speaking in front of the public or in front of a crowd or in any other venue where they know a lot of people are listening.
Yeah, I mean,
um,
absolutely, Lena. This is most of the people I work with. They're not speakers. They're entrepreneurs that want to boost business. They're executives that want to get a promotion. They're pastors that want to get more tithes. These aren't people that necessarily want to be on stages. Your stage is your quickest way to having impact. I mean, and that you talked about it in the introduction. I always tell people there's basically three types of motivation in any audience. There are people, we can generalize here. We'll say, so your 20-year-olds, they're interested in how do I boost my income? Your 40-year-olds, they've already made it, but they're not spending enough time at home. And so they're wondering, how can I boost my freedom? And then your 60-year-olds, they've already made it and they're thinking about their legacy. And so they're wondering, well, how can I boost my impact? If you can address all of those things in your presentation, you're addressing all the needs of your audience. Now, in terms of a person not wanting to speak, the format that Jimmy and I teach people, this can be used in front of a conference room, in front of a ballroom, but it can also be used in an elevator pitch. Heck, I've used the same format when I'm apologizing to my wife of how to structure the apology, and there's always a clear call to action, things like that. But this is a skill. Every skill can be trained. That's what I love. I mean, I was an educator for many years, and I was pumping up a school in India, and I got all the kids all excited. And at the end of my presentation, a 6-year-old boy comes up to me. He has tears in his eyes, and I notice he's missing his left arm. And he says, "How can somebody like me succeed?" And so I crouched down, got to his eye level. I said, when I was your age, I went to 18 different schools before I was 12 years old. Everybody called me stupid because I stuttered. And basically, I eventually went to a school where a teacher, she spent time one-on-one with me, and she would sing things to me, and I found I could sing them back without my stutter. It's kind of like the movie The King's Speech. And eventually I lost my stutter and I became a swan. But I looked at that little boy and I said, isn't it interesting that the little boy everybody said was stupid because he couldn't talk right now gets paid extraordinary sums to go around the world to do what? And he got the biggest grin on his face. He's like, "Speak." I'm like, "Never let anybody tell you what you can't do. Everything is possible." I mean, we see this this is what we were talking about with the book. Is I want people to see all the possibilities. There are people, next time you think you have it tough, read The Miracle Worker. You'll read about Helen Keller, who's one of the most extraordinary human beings ever to walk the face of the planet, and her teacher Annie Sullivan, who's the most patient person I've ever seen. Anything is possible. I mean, I remember 30 years ago. 30 years ago, I was teaching fifth grade in Compton, California, and one of my boys comes up to me and says, "Hey, Miss Brassell, my mama says the reason they call it the White House is because you got to be white to live there." Now I could look at him and say, "Not anymore. Anything is possible," and I think people need to hear. This is why I was drawn to you, Lena. I mean, my underhanded commitment is I think we need more women and more minorities on stages. I mean, it's great that I get to be on stages, but I think the world is a large place. People need diverse opinions. I mean, so for example, when I went to India speaking to those Indian kids, it's one thing coming from me, but if they're all girls, it's even more of something if it comes from you. And let's say they're all Indian girls and you're an Indian woman giving that. Don't get me wrong. I don't believe race and gender is everything, but it is something. It is something because people need to see themselves in that person. And this is what motivates me is working with people just like you, where it's like, wow, here's a person that can reach out and touch people that they might be afraid of speaking. I mean, heck, most people are afraid of speaking, but it's all in the reps. You get better. It's the same thing with your podcast. Your first podcast stunk. Well, your second podcast, it stunk, but it didn't stink as much as your first podcast. And every single time you do one, you get better. That's how it goes. This is evolution. And it's the same thing with speaking. I mean, Gustavo was great because he was good on his first, but he's not. I had one guy, Jason, I worked with 3 years ago. So Jason, I told him, I'm like, you got to practice. And so what did Jason do? I had him go on Facebook Live. So Jason goes and he does his speech on Facebook Live, and one person accidentally from Ontario, Canada, watched him speak, and he stunk. And the next day, he did the same speech, and he had like three people from all over, and he stunk, but he didn't stink as bad as the first day. Well, here's the teaching point, Lena. 3 years later, he's got 6,000 people in his community now, and he didn't make seven figures last year, but he almost made seven figures because he did the work. It's the reps. This isn't
Mm-hmm.
rocket science. Anybody tells you it is rocket science, they're lying to you. Like you get better with experience. All of us are an amateur. Before you're a pro, everybody's an amateur. I guarantee you, that next level. Everybody's always afraid of the next level. Like you see a college player that starts in the NFL, that first start, I don't care what they say, they're nervous because they don't think they belong there. And after a while, they start to feel like they belong there. Whoever becomes the president, I don't care who you are, that first day in the White House, you don't think you belong there because you're not used to it. After a year, then you're very comfortable. Any kid that goes from kindergarten to first grade, they're scared. But after a while, they're like, oh, this is no big deal. All of us are amateurs before we're pros.
Oh, that's so great. That is so good that you said that. I think that's inspiring to anyone who is starting out. And something that you mentioned that I thought was very, very interesting that you can use, there's so many different platforms in which you can practice. You can, start your own podcast. You can go live on Facebook and practice there. But what about those who are interested in taking the next step and they're thinking, where should I speak? How do I find places or outside of my local network to speak? Where should I be marketing myself as a speaker to? How would one do that? And when you in your coaching, do you actually help them figure out how they can strategically decide what would be their best audience?
Whenever I'm working with a person, every now and then somebody actually wants to become a speaker. And so whenever I'm working with a client, the first two questions are the most important questions I always ask. I'm like, who is your audience? And what is the problem that you solve? And if you can answer those questions, you have a speech. If you can't answer those questions, then we got to work on it. And I'm a big believer in you start with the lowest hanging fruit. And so, for example, I speak all over the world now to all kinds of different audiences. But when I first started out, I was speaking to parents because I was a teacher. So I felt comfortable with parents. And then I expanded from parents to I would speak to the teachers and to the teachers and the kids because I was used to that. And then I would expand to the administrators. And then I thought, oh, I'm just an educator. And a friend of mine, he's a very successful salesman. He's like, oh, will you train my sales team? And I said, no, I don't really have any experience in that. And he says, Danny, if you can get middle school kids to read Shakespeare, you can help my salespeople get motivated. And it gave me a different attitude. And so I started working with salespeople. I mean, now, and everybody thinks that what they do is very unique. Well, there's common elements to all of them. When I first started speaking, Lena, I'm a big believer in you should always have a contract, no matter what. And so I was speaking for free probably the first 150 speeches I delivered, but I still had a contract. And in my contract, I said, I will waive my fee in exchange for, and I'd ask 10 things like, I want a written endorsement. I want a videotape of my speaking. Oh, like if some organizations have a newsletter, I want to be able to write a monthly column in your newsletter. I want the names of 4 people that you think could benefit from my speeches. So I had all those different criteria. And what I was doing is that I was building my business with word of mouth. And I was blessed. I believe, you want to get better at anything, you need to hire a coach. I mean, look at Tiger Woods. Tiger Woods, the greatest golfer ever to live, in my opinion. Tiger Woods has a putting coach. He has a driving coach. He has a short game coach. He has a mental coach. Maybe he needed a relationships coach, but all of us have our flaws. But he got a coach. Same thing with me is I got a coach when I was starting my business. And he said something which was great. He said, Danny, because I asked him what I should charge. He said, well, if you want to be a $10,000 an hour speaker, you have to look the part. You can't be handing out something that you printed off on the photocopier that day. You have to have an actual glossy brochure. You need to have your website. You need to look the part. You need video of you. It takes a while to get these things. I mean, a lot of people, they just start off oh, I want to speak and I want to make $20,000 a speech. I'm like, well, good for you. Let's see how that goes. You need to show that you're worth $20,000, and eventually you'll get there. But it doesn't just happen overnight. It's the reps, and that's why I'm comfortable in this situation. I'll give you an example. I had a woman a couple of months ago, and I answered her question. We were doing Q&A, and she was just blown away. She came up to me afterwards. She's like, I'd love to be a speaker like you, Danny, but I'm not as quick as you. And I looked at her, and I said, well, that question you asked me, it's been asked 500 times before. So before you asked me that question, I had 500 opportunities to craft the perfect answer to make me sound so intelligent and amazing to you. It's the reps. It's all the reps. And so again, when a person's starting out, don't be afraid I'd rather fall on I'm glad I haven't been on Oprah. I have friends that have been on Oprah that aren't millionaires. And I'm like, you did it wrong then. Because if you go on Oprah with her audience, you should be a millionaire. But you screwed it up. You weren't prepared on making a call to action and things like that. I'd much rather fall on my face in front of three drunks at a nightclub instead of, Kevin Hart, to become one of the best comedians in the world, he didn't start off doing Madison Square Garden. He went to that place at 3 a.m. where there's 3 drunks and nobody's laughing. And the thing I admire the most about Kevin Hart is he drove from Philadelphia to New York City every single day of the week, doing that for a couple of years. And people don't see the work. It takes a lot of hard work. And so I encourage anybody to be a speaker, but you're not going to be unless you're a celebrity, you're not going to be making $25,000 for a speech unless you can show that you're worth $25,000. And you're just not like that when you're starting out.
Wow, fascinating. So let's pivot a little bit and talk about reading. You have this reading program. Can you make the connection, or is there a connection between reading and public speaking? And if there is a connection, what is it?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to have stories. And so I was working with a woman, and I gave her the exact same exercise I just shared with your audience. And she told me, she's like, well, nothing interesting's ever happened to me. I'm like, oh, you're 48 years old. You have no stories whatsoever. I'm like, okay, if you're going to be difficult, if you look at one of the most successful personal development books of all time, it's Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, in which he shares no personal stories. All of his stories are of interviews with interesting millionaires that he interviewed. And so this is why I'm reading constantly, looking for stories. I'm always looking for what's an interesting catch. I read a book recently, and the book stunk. It wasn't interesting, but there was one story in it. It was worth the entire read. It was about it was a marketing book, and it was this advertising executive going around the world trying to figure out what's the next big thing. Couldn't find it. He's in Chile watching these fishermen fish, and he notices that the fish that they're supposed to catch, there's this type of fish, but then there's these other fish that are caught. And he noticed that they were eating the other type of fish. And he said, oh, do you eat the other type of fish because you get paid for this fish? And they're like, no. Well, obviously, yeah, we do, but this is actually a better tasting fish. He's like, oh, well, can I try it? And so they let him try it. He's like, oh my gosh, this is so much better than that fish that you were catching. He's like, what's it called? And they're like, oh, it's called the toothfish. He's like, the toothfish? That's the worst name I've ever. And then he thought about it. He's like, oh. So he introduced it to the United States, but now it's called the Chilean sea bass, which is the most popular type of fish out there. Mm-hmm. Now that's a great story. I got that from reading a really bad book, but I got that story, and when I did this on the leadership book, I can show you in the military, in entertainment, even in athletics, there's lots of people that are successful at their trades, but the people that are most successful are the people that read. These people are constantly reading. A lot of people don't remember this, but President Kennedy, when he was at a press conference once, and a journalist asked him what he was reading, and he just said, oh, I'm reading this cool spy novel about this guy named James Bond. Well, MGM was watching that press conference. They bought the rights to James Bond, and the reason we have the 007 movies is because of a flippant comment from President Kennedy. People don't know that. Um,
I didn't
you
know.
know,
Yeah.
LeBron James, I mean, I could have kissed the man because when he was playing for the Miami Heat before the finals, they showed him in the locker room reading The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. And I'm like, dude, that image, you just got more kids interested in reading than I can ever do in my entire life. And LeBron is just hugely successful. He's an avid reader. You look at the military. They say General Schwarzkopf could read in 6 languages and quote Shakespeare voraciously. You look in business, Warren Buffett, Elon Musk, these are some of the richest people in the world. How do they spend their days reading? They say that Elon Musk, even though he's running 4 companies, he still reads an entire book every single day. Warren Buffett, he brags that he goes to work every day, and that's all he does is he reads every single day. So I don't care what you're into, whatever you're interested. I mean, if you look at actors, they're reading scripts all the time, and so that's the other thing I point out to people. You don't have to be reading novels. There's lots of different things. You could be reading a script. You could be reading poetry. You look at the basketball coach John Wooden. That's one of the things I always admired about him speaking was he would quote different poems he had learned reading growing up. One of my favorites that he quotes is "No written word, no written word, no nor spoken plea can teach our youth what they should be, nor all the books on all the shelves. It's what the teachers are themselves." I love watching him speak. He always has all these little different anecdotes. I mean, I do that when I'm speaking. Is I might use a reference from a Dr. Seuss book. It doesn't have to be Shakespeare. I mean, sometimes I'll use Shakespeare. It doesn't matter. But this is why you're reading. Is it's making you more interesting. I mean, for your podcast, when you're looking at people to interview, you're looking for an interesting person. You're reading their bio. This is how we reap what we sow. And so anybody who knows me knows I always have about 5 books on me because I'm constantly interested in storytelling. And I love to watch how different people do it. And I read every genre. I mean, I have one of the top book clubs in the world online, lazyreaders.com. Every month I give 10 book recommendations, 3 or 4 adult level, 3 or 4 young adult level, and 3 or 4 children's level books, all under 250 pages for people that say they have no time to read. One of the strategies I share with parents is I'm not that interesting. And so before I go to a party, I go to either the bookstore or the library. I go to the children's section and I read all these little picture books about famous people. So I have a whole bunch of facts at my disposal. I mean, people think I know a lot about Thomas Edison. Well, I just read a 32-page picture book on Thomas Edison. So I learned some random information. It's a very long answer to your short question, but that's why you need to read. It's to be more interesting to have those stories at your disposal. I mean, some people collect cars, some people collect stamps. I collect stories.
Wow, that's excellent. That's a great answer. So, no, I think it's important because we live in such a visually dominated information. It's the way we consume information today more than ever. And with AI, I don't even know what's going to happen with that because AI is revolutionizing how we consume information. And so, in terms of technology, I noticed too that younger generations they learn more from video than they do from actually reading books. So, what is your take on, how is that going to also change the speaking industry when we go and we start, talking about things? How do you think AI? And I read this book called The Shallows. I don't know if you've ever read it, but it really talks about what the internet is doing to our brains
Mm,
and how it is affecting our attention spans. And he used to be able to sit down with a book for hours and hours, and then he found out that he started. It was less and less time that he was able to just sit and focus and read a book. When he used to be able to do what he used to be able to do for hours, he could only do for like a half an hour. Then he
mm.
had to go get up and do something else. And how all these distractions, social media, going through those feeds, what that does to our brains. As an educator, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm a person, Lena. I always embrace technology. I don't fear technology. I figure out ways to use it to my advantage. I mean, 3,000 years ago, the Greeks thought that education was going down the toilet because students had to actually start writing things down rather than just memorizing it. And then we had people saying, oh, television is the death of our schools. Oh, it's the internet. It's social media. It's AI. Insert here. Some of my favorite strategies include technology. I mean, I have 3 kids of my own. I believe television is here to stay. And so one of the first strategies I share with parents is, turn on the closed captioning. And people say, well, wait a sec.
That's
If the show is
interesting.
in English and the subtitles are in English, what good does that do? I'm like, well, that's a fair point, but let me make a point. Have you ever watched a show with subtitles and not looked at the subtitles? It's actually very difficult to do. Your brain's actually directed towards the text. And there's actual research that demonstrates this. If you look at reading scores around the world, the more kids watch TV, the lower their reading scores are in every single country on the planet except for one. The country where the kids watch the most TV has the highest reading scores on the planet. It's Finland. And people always ask, well, how can that be? I'm like, well, because Finland makes really bad TV shows. And so what they have to do is they have to import all these old American sitcoms like Happy Days and Welcome Back, Kotter and Good Times. And they translate everything to Finnish. The kids are reading constantly. I always tell parents, turn on the TV. You were talking about people looking at YouTube and on their phones and things like that. I'm like, YouTube's done studies that 80% of the videos watched on YouTube are watched with the sound off. And so that's why it's so important for us as speakers always having captioning of our presentations. And the reason is because people, rather than paying attention at work or in school, they're sitting there on their phones and they don't want to be caught. And so they're reading it all the time. I tell people that today, a kid has more access to reading material just today than a kid growing up in the 18th century had their entire lifetime. So I don't fear these things. I love artificial intelligence. Think about that. We're taping a podcast right now, which with the AI, it can immediately transcribe this podcast. And if we want, we can then feed that into more AI to create a book, to create a whole series. We could, you probably just market this like crazy. I mean, and the thing I was pointing out to a teacher the other day, she was concerned about AI. Oh, the kids are cheating. I'm like, well, first of all, just so you know, kids know it's there. They're not stupid. So I've never been a person that says, oh, you have to get everybody off their devices. What I think we need to do is train people how to use them in the right way. Usually it's the lowest common denominator immediately takes over. So when social media came out, it was all the negative stuff. But if you intentionally keep those elements away from you and say, oh, I'm only going to focus on the positive. I mean, I have rules on my social media. The moment somebody posts something political, they're gone. I don't want to hear it. I want you can show me pictures of your puppies, but the moment they're campaigning for something, nope, I don't want it. It's negative. I don't like negative stuff. I want things that make me happy. I think artificial intelligence gives us a great opportunity because what it's teaching us is the answers are not as important as the questions. The more you can question the AI and guide it, the better the answers will be. And so that's what I love. I mean, as a podcast host, you need to start paying attention to, oh, how do I formulate these questions on AI? Let's see what kinds of answers it gives me. And that's to me, that's a whole evolution of our education. So I don't fear these things at all. And as a speaker, my goodness, I mean, now, I have 17 books that I've written, and now I feel dumb because I could have had AI write these things based on speeches, which it can do immediately. I mean, you can tell it. You can actually teach the AI how to speak in your voice, or like, let's say I want to have an interview and I want my questions to sound like Les Brown, and you feed it a Les Brown speech and it understands Les Brown, and it'll actually form the questions like it sounds like Les Brown is asking the question, or insert whoever. And so I get excited about these things. The other thing I get excited about is kind of the Justin Bieber effect. Justin Bieber was some kid in Canada that was just posting a whole bunch of YouTube videos, and Usher discovered him, and now he's like a worldwide phenomena. And that's exciting if you think about it, Lena. I'm like, right now, there's some poor kid in Cambodia, mom and dad are out in the rice fields working. This kid might not have had breakfast, but if this kid has an internet connection and a laptop, they have the same access as you and me and the president of Google. the world just got a whole lot smaller. You don't have to be born in New York City or London anymore to change the world. And I, for one, get very excited when I think about these things, but I'm an optimist.
Yeah, well, speaking of, that's a good segue into this other question I wanted to ask you. When we first spoke, I asked you about your spiritual grounding. How you and you told me you were a Christian. How does your theology or being a Christian inform how you go out and speak to people? And does it connect to what you were saying earlier about your purpose? Why you're here? What problems are you solving? And in terms of what you want to give your audience, how does that help you uh, do your speaking engagements?
And nobody's ever asked me that question, Lena. That's a beautiful question. I don't know why we're all forbidden to talk about our faith in the world, but it seems like we are. I mean, that's my entire purpose. Before I go on a stage, I just ask God. I'm like, please use me as an instrument, and that's how I. It's kind of weird. Is my stage gets me closer to God. This is going to sound pathetic, but one of my favorite movies is Chariots of Fire, about these white runners in the 1920s. This movie, so it's about a Jewish runner, and then there's a Christian runner named Eric Liddell. This is based on a true story, and Eric Liddell, there's this wonderful scene where he's with his sister and he looks back at Edinburgh in Scotland. He's like, "Wow, it's beautiful. I'm really going to miss it. I've made my decision, Jenny. I'm going to go back and do the mission work in China." And she's elated because they're big Christians. He's like, "But first I'm going to run in the Olympics." And now she becomes disappointed. He's like, "Jenny, I believe God made me for a purpose, and that's for the missions in China. But he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure." Lena, every time I see that scene, I get chills because there are times on stage where I sound brilliant and it wasn't me. God gave me the words. And chills right now. And I'm like, I get closer to God every time I'm on a stage. And again, this goes back to, it's kind of like reading the Bible. I mean, I guess it depends on how you want to read it. Most people, I guess a lot of people read it to see what everybody's doing wrong. I read it in an entirely different way. It lifts me up. I see humor in it. I always look for the funny thing. I mean, one of my favorite verses is Genesis 50, 20, where Jacob has passed away, and now Joseph's brothers, they're like, "Oh no, we left Joseph for dead, and now dad's gone, and Joseph, he's going to take his vengeance out on us." And they're really swarmy. They go up and like, "Hey Joe, before Dad died, he said you're not supposed to take vengeance on that thing that we did and leaving you for dead." And it's a really nice moment, Lena, because Joseph looks at him and he's like, "Oh no, everything you meant for evil, God meant for good." This is our power from a stage, Lena. You and I are flawed people because we're people. Everybody's flawed. Mm-hmm. It's probably the best strategy I always share with people. My number one speaking strategy: don't share your successes, share your failures, because not everybody has succeeded, but they've all failed. And the more you talk about your own vulnerability, they're going to love you. So that is kind of a nice question, Lena. Nobody's ever asked me that, but I thank you for that. But it's very important to me, my faith, and it's really why I do what I do.
Wow. Wow. That's great. That's a great answer. And so if someone wanted to know more about you, purchase your book, all those things, how would they contact you? What's the best way to contact you? I think it's exciting. I'm going to be watching you a lot more now that we've spoken, because you just exude, though. It is a gift. There's positivity and people just being uplifted. So how would they get in contact with you? How would they get more about what you're doing and reading your books and so on?
Well, thank you so much for those kind comments and all that you do, Lena. So as a thank you to you and your audience for having to listen to me, I want to give everybody a couple of freebies. So if you go to freegiftfromdanny.com, again, freegiftfromdanny.com, I want to give everybody a complimentary e-copy of my book, Read, Lead, and Succeed. This is a book I wrote for an elementary school principal who was trying to keep his faculty and staff positively engaged. So I said, okay, I'll write you a book. So every week I give you a concept, an inspirational quote, an inspirational story, a book recommendation on a book you should read, but you're probably too lazy because you're an adult. So I also give you a children's picture book recommendation. You can read that in 5 minutes, demonstrates the same concept. Also, I wanted to give everybody access to a 5-day reading challenge I did online last summer for about 700 parents around the world, where every day for an hour, I give you all kinds of strategies to get your kids to read more, read better, and most importantly, to love reading. Because I find schools do an adequate job of teaching kids how to read. But the question I always ask people is, what good is it teaching a kid how to read if they never want to read? I teach kids why to read because I've never had to tell a kid, go turn on the TV. I've never had to tell a kid, go play a video game. And I never want to have to tell a kid, go read. I want them to choose to do it because they love it. And there's simple strategies I love to share with people on ways to get kids engaged in reading. You can get both of those at freegiftfromdanny.com. And Lena, thank you so much. This is like, man, I
Oh,
feel like
thank you.
I'm bathed in happiness right now. This is a wonderful forum you've provided me. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate you for coming. And I'm sure our audience walked away with a lot of valuable information. So thank you for being a guest today.